A reading from Genesis 29, 1 through 14. Jacob arrives at Paddan Aram. Then Jacob hurried on, finally arriving in the land of the east. He saw well in the distance 3 flocks of sheep and goats lay in an open field beside it, waiting to be watered. But a heavy stone covered the mouth of the well. It is the custom there to wait for all the flocks to arrive before removing the stone and watering the animals. Afterward, the stone would be placed back over the mouth of the well. Jacob went over to the shepherds and asked, "Where are you from, my friends?" "We are from Haran," they answered. "Do you know a man there named Laban, the grandson of Nahor?" he asked. "Yes, we do," they replied. "Is he doing well?" Jacob asked. "Yes, he's well," they answered. "Look, here comes his daughter Rachel with the flock now." Jacob said, "Look, it's still broad daylight, too early to round up the animals. Why don't you water the sheep and goats so they could get back out to pasture?" "We can't water the animals until all the flocks have arrived," they replied. Then the shepherds moved the stone from the mouth of the well, and we watered all the sheep and goats. Jacob was still talking with them when Rachel arrived with her father's flock, for she was a shepherd. And because Rachel was his cousin, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and because the sheep and goats belonged to his uncle Laban, Jacob went over to the well and moved the stone from its mouth and watered his uncle's flock. Then Jacob kissed Rachel, and he wept aloud. He explained to Rachel that he was her cousin on her father's side, the son of her aunt Rebekah. So Rachel quickly ran and told her father Laban. As soon as Laban heard that his nephew Jacob had arrived, he ran out to meet him. He embraced and kissed him and brought him home. When Jacob told him his story, Laban exclaimed, "You really are my own flesh and blood."
Thank you, Tanya. And thank you, Minister Patrice. "55 to 60% of all communication is nonverbal. Better than 35% of communication is voice, intonation, and inflection. That means that about 7% of our communication comes from the actual words we speak. Now, that fact alone explains why there are so many misunderstandings via text and email and even our own Slack. It's not that writing is a terrible way to communicate, it's just that we have gotten lazy in our writing. We don't put forth the effort and the attention to detail that would be required to communicate in the way that used to be required even 75 years ago. We often refer to nonverbal communication as social cues. Now, social cues, they come in all shapes and sizes. Social cues, they come from our posture, our facial expressions, our eyes, our mouths, our hands, our whole body, just to name a few. To give you an example, if you're talking to me and we're having what you believe is an important conversation and I keep looking at my phone, what does that communicate to you? What's that? One, I'm not paying attention. What else might it communicate? That I'm not interested, that it's not important, that you're not important, that I have somewhere I got to be, that I'm expecting important. I mean, there's a host of things that it can mean, right? Not just one thing, but a lot of things, yeah? Now, how about this one? You're sharing your opinion with me on my last sermon, and while you continue to talk, I do this number. What does that communicate to you? That I'm not caring too much for your opinion of my last sermon, right? Right? I'm closed off, I'm defensive, I'm just wanting this conversation to be over. And I haven't said a word, right? That's a social cue. Now, when a whole crowd is doing that as a pastor, you just take a collection and sit down. That's... How about if you come up to me to talk to me and I turn my back? Well, now that's just an outright act of disrespect, isn't it? Yeah? How about if you roll your eyes? Now, rolling your eyes can mean 1,000 things, can't it? Don't you think? Huh? No, I roll my eyes all the time. I get in trouble for it all the time, too. No, it can mean a lot of different things, right? See, every social cue has several meanings, just like the way we use our words. And so even though you read a social cue, or 5 or 6, you may not fully know what they're thinking, but you can get a feel, right? And how about cultural cues as well? Do you know in Indonesia, if I rub my nose with one finger like this, it means I'm thinking. In England, if I tap my nose, I mean it's top secret. If I blow my nose in public in the United States or England, people can think that's rude. My wife gets totally grossed out when that happens. But if you blow your nose in Japan, it's a sign that you're healthy. See, there are cultural cues as well, depending on the culture as to what you mean, right? Now get this one. What does this mean in the United States? Okay. Okay, right? What does it mean in England? It means okay as well, right? In Japan, this means money. In Tunisia, this means I will kill you. In France, this means zero or worthless. So, knowing the social and cultural cues of those with whom you converse is essential to communicating effectively. Understanding what's been communicated in the past, it's really helpful to have some understanding of the social and cultural cues. If you were to ever looking for a passage in the Bible that was loaded with social and cultural cues, then John chapter 4 is an excellent choice. Allow me to read it to you. John chapter 4, and I'll start with verse 1. Jesus knew the Pharisees had heard that he was baptizing and making more disciples than John, and though Jesus himself didn't baptize, his disciples did. So he left Judea and he returned to Galilee. He had to go through Samaria on the way. Eventually he came to the Samaritan village of Sychar, near the field that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired from the long walk, sat wearily beside the well about noontime. Soon a Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Please give me a drink." He was alone at the time because his disciples had gone into the village to buy some food. The woman was surprised, for Jews refused to have anything to do with Samaritans, and she said to Jesus, "You're a Jew and I'm a Samaritan woman. Why are you asking me for a drink?" And Jesus replied, "If you only knew the gift of God, if you only knew the gift God has for you and who you are speaking to, you would ask me, and I would give you living water." "But sir, you don't have a rope or a bucket," she said, "and this well is very deep. Where would you get this living water? And besides, do you think you're greater than our ancestor Jacob, who gave us this well? How can can you offer better water than he and his sons and his animals enjoyed?" And Jesus replied, "Anyone who drinks this water will soon become thirsty again. But those who drink the water I give will never be thirsty again. It becomes a fresh, bubbling spring within them, giving them eternal life." "Please, sir," the woman said, "give me this water. Then I'll never be thirsty again, and I won't have to come here to get water." The well at Sychar, that's Jacob's well. It's about 100 feet deep. Now, especially with a well that deep, and with water being heavy as it is, normally women came in groups to draw the water, because that sort of heavy work is better done in groups. They'd normally come around 10 in the morning or before 10 in the morning. If not at 10 in the morning, then they came somewhere between 4, maybe even as late as 6 in the evening. You see, it's not a job that you want to do in the heat of the day, especially since there's no shelter at Jacob's well. There's no shade. You got the sun bearing down on you while you're dropping your bucket down 100 feet to draw up water. That makes for a long, hot job. See, the only reason you would come by yourself in the heat of the day to do such heavy work is if you weren't welcomed into one of the groups that comes earlier or comes later. Now, there's a lot of reasons why you might not be welcome with the groups that came earlier or the groups that came later. The most prominent detail would have to do with what we discover later on in this story with this Samaritan woman. You see, if you've been married and divorced and married and divorced and married and divorced several times, and or you're living with someone you aren't married to, then you would be seen as unclean, maybe even seen as the scourge of the town. But as a counterbalance to this, let me just remind you that back then, men divorced women. Women did not divorce men. So, as in the case of this woman that Jesus interacts with, you need to know that she's been married and divorced 5 times, and she's living with a man that she's not married to. Well, there's a really good chance that she hasn't been unfaithful all those times. Because you see, if she had, her reputation would have preceded her, and she wouldn't have gotten, say, 3 other men to propose. About after the second time, she would be done. Another reason could be that because she is infertile. But again, word would have gotten around by the 3rd or 4th husband that she was infertile. It could be that she widowed a couple of times, but probably not all 5 times, because again, by the 3rd time, I'm not certain anyone would have been brave enough to marry her. So it had to be some mix of something in there. Maybe she was just beautiful and attractive, but she couldn't cook, because that's all it took to be divorced. Maybe she was beautiful and lovely and wonderful and she couldn't keep house. Or maybe she burned the sheets, or I don't know. Because it only takes saying, "I divorce you," to begin the process. Even so, being rejected by 5 men, or even if a couple of them have died, marks her as an unacceptable woman. Living with someone she's not married to, that would sometimes happen if they were getting up the money to get their marriage registered. But as a general rule, by the time you've had 5 husbands, that's probably not what's going on. And since you are a woman and you have no rights, it's kind of any port in a storm. You got it? So imagine this. It's hot. Jesus is tired. Jesus is hungry. Jesus is thirsty. He sends his disciples off to find food. He sits down by the well. This woman comes along in the heat of the day by herself. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to read the social cues and note that she is by herself in the heat of the day for a reason. And so look at verse 6 again. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired from the long walk, sat wearily beside the well about noontime. Soon a Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Please give me a drink." He was alone at the time because his disciples had gone into the village to buy some food. And the woman was surprised, for Jews refused to have anything to do with Samaritans. And she said to Jesus, "You're a Jew and I'm a Samaritan woman. Why are you asking me for a drink?" Now, looking at this from Jesus' perspective, you might think it's obvious. Well, the reason he's asking her for a drink is because, he's thirsty, right? But you need to recognize that Jesus is breaking some serious taboos here. Jewish man talking to a Samaritan woman, a Jewish rabbi talking to a Samaritan woman alone. It was thought at that time, especially in serious Samaritan towns, that if a woman was alone with a man and they spoke for longer than 20 minutes, it was the same as having committed adultery. That's how serious this non-fraternization thing goes. But from her perspective, I want you to consider the possibility that she thought she might be on to husband number 6. Now you might be thinking, hold the phone, how could I possibly come to that? Well, press the pause button for a minute, okay? Now this woman, she's going to talk about her father Jacob and his well. She's a Samaritan woman. That means she knows her history, even if she hasn't studied it. She's been taught it from a young age. Part of what it means to be a Samaritan, different than what it means to be a Jew, is a Samaritan only studies the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, called the Torah: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. They don't read the prophets. They don't read any of the other books. That's just what they study. So this woman is familiar with these 5 books. And since she's familiar with these 5 books, it's not a leap for me to suggest to you that she knows the story from Genesis chapter 24. When Abraham and Sarah send a servant of theirs back to Sarah's country to find a bride for their only son, Isaac. And that servant goes back, and what happens? The servant just wants to succeed, and he says, "Lord, please, I'm just going to be here by the well, and the woman that I need to find for Isaac, let her just ask me. I'll ask her for water, and she'll offer not only to give me water, but to feed my camels and my livestock that I've brought with me." And sure enough, that's exactly what happens. He goes to the well. A woman comes to the well by herself, and he says, "Can I have something to drink?" And she says, "Well, not only you can have something to drink, but I'll water all of your livestock as well." Turns out her name is Rebecca. So Rebecca is taken back, and she marries Isaac, and they more or less they live happily ever after. All right? Now, this woman, she knows that story. Genesis chapter 29. Jacob, one of the twin sons of Isaac and Rebekah, he has to hightail it because he's cheated his brother out of his birthright, and his brother is fit to be tied. And so his mama, Rebekah, sends him back to her homeland, to her brother Laban. Tanya, she read that for us. And so Jacob goes back there, and when he gets to the well and finds out this is the place, and he finds out that his uncle Laban's flock is there, and he sees a woman coming, he pushes off this heavy rock, and he draws the water, and he waters all the flock. And then he kisses Rachel, and he tells her who he is. And it turns out that his uncle takes him in, and the woman he sees at the well is the woman he falls in love with. And they, more or less, are happily ever after. And if that doesn't convince you that maybe she thinks this is number 6, how about this one for you? In Exodus chapter 2, when Moses is running like a scalded dog from Pharaoh, and he goes across the wilderness to the land of Midian, and there he comes to a place where these 7 daughters of Reuel or Jethro, depending on which name you want to use, are there to water their flocks, but these bully ne'er-do-well shepherds push them away so they can water theirs, and Moses does the whole Steven Seagal thing, and then he waters their flock for them, and they take him back to Jethro. And what does he do? He marries the oldest daughter that he met there at the well, Zipporah. Meeting men at the well seems to be a pretty good deal. And so if you're familiar with the history, do not assume that you know what she's thinking. Because maybe after all these years and after all these disappointments, she's finally got her Moses. She's finally got her Jacob. Come on, it's no coincidence that later on in the story, when he says to her, "Go get your husband," she says, "Oh, I don't have a husband." She leaves out the part about living with somebody. Now, of course, I don't know this for certain, but I am just suggesting to you that there's way more to the story than what most of us see when we read it. Now, press play. Scott read a passage, the beginning of our time together, that is especially important to us. Listen to Ephesians chapter 2, verse 14 again. For Christ himself has brought peace to us. He united Jews and Gentiles into one people when in his own body on the cross, he broke down the wall of hostility that separated us. Now, as some of you may know, this is the verse where we get our name. The broken wall. Jesus broke down the wall of hostility that separated us. Jesus broke down the wall of hostility that separated us. And Jesus did that. He started doing that long before the cross. You need to know that. He did that from the beginning of his ministry. In John chapter 3, he talks to the religious and social elite, this guy named Nicodemus. But you got to know that Nicodemus came looking for Jesus. His disciples, they came looking for him, all except for Philip. Philip is the only one that Jesus goes looking for. And it appears to me that Jesus goes looking for this woman in John chapter 4. And in talking with this Samaritan woman, Jesus breaks 3 walls. He breaks down 3 barriers. The male-female barrier, the Jew-Samaritan barrier, and the righteous-unrighteous barrier. And his first move isn't to offer help, but to ask for help. He humbles himself and says, "Can I have a drink of water?" And verse 9, the woman was surprised. You bet she was surprised. For Jews refused to have anything to do with Samaritans. And she said to Jesus, "You are a Jew and I am a Samaritan. Why are you asking me for a drink?" And now that you know a little bit more about her story, you know that she's really asking, what do you really want? You here alone at the well at noon. What is it that you really want? She knows too well how some of those conversations go. And Jesus says, get your mind out of the gutter. Don't flatter yourself. You can't be serious. No, of course not. He's Jesus. Jesus replied, if you only knew the gift of God, the gift God has for you and who you are speaking to, you would ask me, and I would give you living water. Now, so that you're not confused, living water is water that moves. Water that comes from a spring or a river. Back then it was believed, even though wells were fed by springs underneath, it was believed that living water was healthier than water from a well because it could be stagnant on top. And she says in verse 11, but sir, you don't have a rope or a bucket. And this well is very deep. Where would you get this living water? And besides, do you think you're greater? I love that. Now, for those of you who've been around for a couple of chapters now, do you think you're greater? No, but everybody else who's written about him is. They're convinced he is. Hey, not greater, supreme. That's what everyone else thinks. But do you think you're greater than our ancestor Jacob who gave us this well? How can you offer better water than he and his sons and his animals enjoyed? Verse 13, Jesus replied, anyone who drinks this water will soon become thirsty again. But those who drink the water I give will never be thirsty again. It becomes a fresh, bubbling spring within them, giving them eternal life. Those who drink the water I give will never be thirsty again. Boy, wouldn't that be grand? To never be thirsty again. Jesus says that water he gives will become a fresh, bubbling spring within them, giving them eternal life. You realize that Nicodemus in the last chapter, he made sense, right? For Jesus to talk to him. He made sense. Nick had credibility. Nick was at the center of power. Don't forget how wealthy his family is. After all, his last name was Ben Gurion. And he's like one of the founding families of Jerusalem, right? Nicodemus, he was articulate and he was educated and he was respected. I mean, if you're looking to start a movement, he would be the kind of guy you would recruit, you know? But the Samaritan woman? She doesn't make sense, not on the surface anyway. 5 times divorced, or maybe 3 times divorced and 2 times widow, or however you want to figure it out if you give her the benefit of the doubt. Living with somebody who's not her husband? What credibility does she have? Seriously, she can't even get a couple of ladies to go help her draw water, all right? Does she make sense? We'll talk more about this amazing conversation next week, if Creator God is willing. In the meantime, I wouldn't mind asking a couple of questions. Do you get the impression, not even knowing the rest of this story, do you get the impression that maybe her history doesn't matter to Jesus? Do you get that impression? Do you get the impression that maybe her brokenness doesn't matter to Jesus? Do you get the impression that her social status doesn't matter to Jesus? Do you realize that Jesus sees in her something that you and I can't? Yeah? You get that, right? Then doesn't it stand to reason that maybe Jesus sees something in each of you that you can't? Doesn't that stand to reason? That's got to be worth thinking about. I hope you do.